So I had exactly $208 in my pocket when I started out, and that's the only money I had. As Bob Garrosh told me, you know, at some stage one has to stop saying one can do this and do it. And it was to me, it was a harsh comment at that time, but it was absolutely
Yeah.
necessary for me. Enrico Fermi would do his calculations on slide rule. They're looking at the reaction rate. He would say, and then Edward Taylor had a log table, and John von
Uh-huh.
Neumann would do it in his head,
Yeah.
and all of them agreed. Then they agreed. It's amazing that such things took place in the University of Chicago. Bob's greatest strengths are his incredible clarity and penetrating reasoning. Right, Chandra had that humility and that rigor, intellectual rigor, to learn from the best. And it doesn't matter if they're young or whatever it is.
In our last conversation, we left off as young Abhay Ashtekar, driven by a deep curiosity, was about to embark on the next chapter of his life. But what happens when that monumental journey begins with just $208 in your pocket? It becomes a story of overcoming incredible odds, from facing discrimination while searching for an apartment to working so intensely his eyesight dramatically worsened. It's a period shaped by pivotal lessons, like one of his advisor, Bob Garrock, commented. At some stage, one has to stop saying one can do this and do it. This path would lead him to the legendary halls of University of Chicago, where legacy of giants like Enrico Fermi was part of the very air, and where he would soon be asked to explain Stephen Hawking's revolutionary new theory on black holes to an audience that included the great Subramaniam Chandrasekhar. We'll hear how Chandra's humility and behind the scenes intervention were crucial for getting Professor Astekar's very first paper published. In this episode, we dive deep into the transformative period, a story not just of physics but finding one's footing in a new world and learning what it truly means to be a scientist. So let's continue this story. Good morning, Professor Ashtekar. How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
I'm good, sir. I'm good. Good to see you again,
Yeah,
sir.
good to see you. I was in conference last week. I was away. I just got back on the yeah on the.
Thank you for making time for this second conversation. In our previous session, we explored your formative years in India and your early education and the influences that shaped your initial interest in physics. Today, I would like to build on that foundation and learn more about your journey through graduate studies. So let's begin where we left last time, sir. So after completing your undergraduate studies or during the undergraduate studies during that time, when you were in college in India, what options did you consider for further education?
Right. So I started thinking about this when I was in my final year of BSc, so the fourth year of undergraduate studies in those days, right? I think the system had changed a little bit since then. So in those days, one got one's high school graduation between 15 and 16, and then one finished one's undergraduate between 19 and 20, basically. So so this was a so I was between 18 and 19 when I started thinking about various options. I think I mentioned to you last time about my uh, uh, fortunate incident that the people in Tata Institute became interested,
Absolutely,
right?
yes,
Particularly Professor
yes.
Udgaonkar, Professor Yashpal, and Professor S.M. Chitre.
Hmm.
So I was a little bit exposed to glimpses of international research, and so I thought that maybe I should go abroad to
Hmm.
for my graduate studies.
Hmm.
So I mean, in those days there was no internet and there was no way of knowing what all is available. So the way that one did was to go to the what was then called USIS, that is to say United States Information Service, which was a small branch
Hmm.
of the U.S. consulate in Mumbai. And so
Hmm.
I went there, and they used to have these brochures from various universities. So I looked at the physics ones, and
Hmm.
these reasons I mentioned to you about cosmology and general relativity, I was interested in relativity and gravitation and cosmology and such things.
Hmm.
And so I tried to focus on those issues. Now, I think it may not be so clear to people at this stage now, But in those days, general relativity and gravity and even cosmology were not the
mm,
forefront fields. The forefront
mm,
fields were in particle physics in those days, particularly, and of course,
mm,
condensed matter physics, which in India we used to be called solid state physics. Various
mm.
interface between experiment and theory, particularly, was very, very strong. So these were the kind of leading fields. And not every university in the United States had a group doing research in general relativity or cosmology. I mean, very, very few had. And among the brochures I found, there was only two. One was Maryland, University of Maryland, which had a sizable group, and actually it was a good group, and University of Texas, which had the biggest group. I mean, they really had no names that I had even vaguely heard of. I mean, it's sort of big people, and at that stage I did not know, but leading researchers internationally, not just Americans, because there was also people from Germany, people from England, and so on. So just I applied to just these two places. It was quite expensive because even the small application fee when I had to get those converted to dollars and
Yeah.
all those things. Uh, so I just applied to these two places, and almost I not immediately returned mail, but very quickly got a reply from Maryland saying that they don't consider students from India for PhD or graduate work unless they have masters, and I was only going to have bachelor's, and I was applying when I did not even have bachelor's. I was in my last year of bachelor's,
Mm,
so
mm.
I said, okay. I mean, so they basically said, well, you can apply in 2 years. But the University of Texas, for some reason, admitted me. I'm sure that letter
Definitely.
from Feynman and probably also letters that Udgaonkar and S.M. Chitre wrote from the Tata Institute for me were the main reasons.
Mm,
I should say that this was the late 60s, 69 precisely.
mm,
And those were the
mm,
boom years for Texas with respect to oil. And so a lot of oil revenue was coming into Texas, and therefore some small percentage of the profits or the revenue that was coming into the state treasury was allocated to the university, and therefore the university was
okay.
expanding a lot. At that
Mm,
time, I came to know this later. Of course, I did not know this when I was a
mhm,
student. At that time, there was a very influential physicist by name Alfred Shield. He was American
mhm,
physicist, but he was very left wing politics, but still he was very vocal and very persuasive. And so he had a lot of clout in the University of Texas Senate and various places. And he managed to
mhm,
get a lot of these funds. And so he created the largest, it was called Center for Relativity, which is in
mhm,
general relativity, that's what they meant. The largest group there. So of course Alfred Shield himself was the director of that. But then you got Jürgen
mhm.
Ehlers, who founded the Albert Einstein Institute in Germany many years later.
Uh,
Then there was Engelbert Schucking, who went on to New York University, and he was a leading cosmologist. There was Rainer Sachs, who had laid foundations of gravitational radiation theory together with Sir Hermann Monti in King's College in London. Ray Sachs was a former student of Peter Bergman's, who himself was an assistant to Einstein. So, there was a real pedigree here. I mean, these people were very, very leading physicists. And then in the second year that I was there, uh, a very bright young person just joined the faculty, and that was
mm,
Bob Garrosh, Robert Garrosh.
mm,
And Garrosh had the kind of distinction, I think, that he got his PhD from John Wheeler in Princeton, and then he went to a postdoc with Roger Penrose Roger used to be in London in those days, and then he came back to United States and had one other additional year of postdoc at Syracuse with Peter Bergman, who was a former assistant of
mm.
Einstein. And then after just 3 years after his PhD, he got a tenured associate professorship in Austin. This is totally unheard of now. I mean, now it's just hopeless. But even in those days, it was completely unheard of because people usually got at that stage,
Go for
yeah, an assistant professor, and then there's a tenure process for 7 years, and at the sixth year you
yes.
got promoted and tenure and such things. So in his third year after PhD, he was a tenured professor. He was considered to be extremely bright and everything. So this and then their astronomy department was also very, very good. and there was a person by
Oh.
the name de Bacular who was a leading astronomer. I'll tell a few things about that in later. And so the group was incredibly lively. And then there were postdocs. Some of them had come from England, and the
Mm.
students were also quite of very good. So, anyways, I was lucky. I mean, I got to see this brochure, applied, and that was a good choice. And so they admitted me with the financial support to be a teaching assistant. I accepted. In those days, everything was quite difficult. It took quite some time to get you on your passport, and of course, the airline ticket was
Mm.
expensive. We are not from
Mm.
a rich family. I mean, my father was well-to-do, but so I had to
Mm.
raise money for even the air ticket. Right? It was not
Yeah.
cheap in the salaries that people got,
Yeah, 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 absolutely.
and of
And
course,
you already mentioned about principles of your father, and
yeah.
so I can understand.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, I was reasonably outgoing. So I found some places, some foundations which actually gave money. Some of it was loan, which I returned. Some of it was just outright money for travel to go up. So I got
That's
some funds in order to. So I did not have to impinge on my parents for that. And in those days, the foreign exchange was very controlled. Believe it or not, but the dollar was only 7.5 rupees. Therefore, for students, they allowed $200 through Reserve Bank of India. So you have to apply through a bank. And of course, one had to figure out all these things. But in India, one had enough network, even though there was no internet to find this thing out. So I got this $200, and then at the airport, as you are exiting, they gave us $8. so so I had exactly $208 in my pocket when I started out, and that's the only money I had. And of course, there was no way of getting any money from India or anything. And looking back, it seemed very adventurous, but in those days, it looked a very normal thing to do. I should say that I had also appeared for what they call the GREs, graduate record exam,
mm,
but only advanced
mm,
physics test. And I didn't
mm,
do spectacularly well, but I did reasonably well. I mean, these are
mm,
supposed to be for undergraduates, last year of people doing their bachelor's in United States, and they are 22,
mm,
so they have had 2 more years of education. So it's like really master students in India.
mm,
Uh, but
mm,
it was I got a respectable score. So then I think in August or September of 1969, I flew to
69.
Austin. It was the first trip abroad outside India. It was quite a
Mm,
experience, I have to say, landing in Austin.
mm,
But people were very nice. I mean, the university had arranged for me to be picked up at the airport and
oh,
take me to a place for a temporary housing. It was not cheap,
mm,
right? I mean, of course, it was subsidized, but still, it was not cheap. I don't know, something like
mm.
$15 a day or something. But I only had $208, so you have to worry
Wow.
about those. You have to find quickly some accommodation and so on. So it was quite.
And how was the shift once you moved to US from India? Culturally, these are two like completely different places, right? So there is a cultural shift, and things which might not be normal in India might be very normal in the US. So how did you react to that, and how was your initial days up and at Austin?
UT Austin. In those days, there are two things, right? Three things.
Mm,
One was I was outside India. The second is that I was not in some place like Chicago or International or Boston or New York or something like that. I was in Austin, and Austin is, of course, it's still an island within Texas, but nonetheless, it's Texas. So there was a strong Texan culture, which is not just U.S. culture, but a Texan culture. And then, I mean, this was 1969, so this was just around the days of the student movements and everything all over the country. 1969 to
mm,
73 or so, there was big student movements, and uh, there was a lot of people on drugs, on marijuana, and so on.
mm.
So the main
Oh,
avenue in front of the university, I mean, the students would hang around on their marijuana trip. So the Texan culture was, I finally, okay, I should go back a little bit. So when I was looking for an apartment, I mean, there was discrimination against non-white people, and so it's
mm.
not
Oh,
easy to get those. In retrospect, this completely countryside. people were the ones who were prejudiced, right? But then, if I finally, through networking with other Indian students, I I found a place because it was being vacated by another Indian family. So therefore, there was a small
Oh,
apartment that I could get in, and the landlords were very kind. I think their name was Kohler. He was a captain in the army, and they had their own house, and behind the house they had a small building where they had created 3 apartments. So I had one of those apartments. It was for me completely comfortable. It was perfectly nice. But most importantly, it was only 15 minutes walk to my department. So it was very, very pleasant.
okay.
And the
Mm.
weather in Austin was very pleasant. It was not super cold or anything like that. So since I came after 20, so students in my class were 2 years older than me because almost all of them were 22. And so I did not have enough background. And so I really had to work extremally hard, particularly during those 2 years in
Mm.
Austin. And I remember distinctly
Mm.
that my glasses, the number changed, right? It was around 0.50 or something diopters, the usual measure, to 4.50 or 4.75. In just those 2 years, I work extremely hard.
Oh.
Like I don't know how many hours a day, but I was very motivated because there was so much to learn and so many different directions.
Mm.
And I was taking
Mm.
my regular course load, and I was also teaching assistant. So I had to grade papers or
Mm.
you know do problem sessions with undergraduates and so on. So it was a very, very, very hectic period. But luckily, that is what helped in answer to your question about this culture shock. I just did not have
Mm.
time or energy to absorb the culture shock. I was so focused,
Mm.
completely focused on this work that this was a bit surprised. But then you have to have some relaxed attitude or some leisure to compare and be
Mm.
shocked. But if you
Yeah,
are so
yeah, yeah.
working so hard, then some ways it is easier because then you're insulated by that.
No bandwidth to think about those things. It's like
Exactly.
completely.
Exactly. No time or energy to think about, or no interest in to think about. So one of the big culture shock, if you like, was uh, since this place was not very far from the university, there are also things which
Mm.
are called fraternities and sororities in the United States. So these are kind of private associations. They're named after Greek. There's a Greek idea. The old idea comes from Greeks, but now it is basically a
Mm-hmm.
social thing for rich people. Often it is,
Mm. Mm.
not always, but often. And so on the weekends, the boys and the girls, the sorority girls only dated the fraternity boys because they were a certain social class and such thing. And on one weekend, I saw this fraternity boys in a Texas way wearing cowboy hats, big
Oh.
cowboy boots, came riding horses
Mm.
on the streets that rented the horses. So horses came in,
Mm.
these wagons, and then so the whole ceremony was that they would ride up to the balcony of the sorority and pick up the girl, and the girl was standing in the balcony. So it was, as I said, it was like
Oh.
a Bollywood movie or something. It was quite a interesting thing. Anyway, so these were the kind of cultural differences.
Yeah, so when you moved to UT Austin, one thing that I want to understand is in terms of physics, what kind of problems you are working at that time? What was your interest? Like, what areas of physics you are trying to master and you were trying to spend more time?
So, I mean, just to sort of illustrate this also to younger people who might want sometime listen to these things. The
Mm.
very first time that I went to the physics department, I mean, it's now in a big building, but it was an old building at that time, and
Mm-hmm.
and it had many of these steps, and I was walking up these steps, and then there was a big door, and then you open, and then you enter the department. So I walked up those steps, opened this big door, entered the department, and then there was a big corridor and with polished floor, left hand side, right hand side, and they're all marked lab this, lab that, etc. And I felt, well, I should not disturb anybody, and so I just walked out. I did not even you know
Oh,
explore the
okay.
building because I thought, wow, I know these guys are doing serious work, and here I am, basically not knowing anything, and I should not.
Mm.
So this kind of awe is
Was,
what I entered. So it is good to understand the psychological state, so to say, this mixture of the fact
mm.
that coming from India and that I was only 20, so I felt I was behind everybody, and so um, so to answer to your question, then so I got quite good advising. I also talked to other
Mm.
Indian students there. They all had come after masters, so they were a little bit worried about me. One had to take 3 courses every semester. So the first semester, I took one undergraduate course in mathematical methods and 2 graduate level
Mm-hmm.
courses. And in the second semester on, I just took graduate level courses. So at that, I mean, I went there, as I mentioned, because I was interested in gravity and cosmology. But of course, in order to reach the research level, you have to have some firm foundations. And so I had to learn basically classical mechanics, electrodynamics, quantum mechanics, mathematical methods. So those are the courses I took in the first year. And I mean, very quickly I got straight A's, and so I felt, that I was keeping up. I had to work very, very hard. There's just no question about it. That these things didn't come easy. I think people should realize that it's not just
Okay.
a. But I did catch up. I mean, in the first year, I more or less managed to catch up with my peers. And my second year, I was still doing well. And then I was again very fortunate, right? I really feel very lucky and I'm grateful. I had a young person teaching quantum mechanics. He was from Portugal, and he's gone back. He
Mm-hmm.
became professor in Portugal, and he taught quantum mechanics in a different way, not in the standard traditional way, slightly different way about
Okay.
emphasizing certain methods, certain aspects, and so on. And I really loved
Mm-hmm.
it. I got into it very quickly, and so on. And so in almost every course, I got the highest grades and so on. And also I was very lucky because Alfred Shield, the director of this relativity center, he was teaching us electrodynamics, and so I took his course. And because I took his course and I did very well, so then he offered me what they call research assistantship. So I did not have to grade papers or teach. I could just
Mm-hmm.
I take courses and think about research and topics. So that happened already in the second year, and that I think was very, very. I mean, that was very good for me. So then in the second year, I basically, and Alfred also, gave me an office in the relativity center, and then he
Mm-hmm.
went on a sabbatical, and therefore his office was empty. And I don't know. I was incredibly lucky. I mean, he had the largest office, right? Biggest thing. So he had 2 desks. And he said, well, why don't you take one of the desks while I was sabbatical? And the other desk was given to somebody who was just freshly joined assistant professor, so faculty member. I mean, I was a lowly graduate student, which was, so again, I was extremely lucky, and I got to know the faculty a little bit better then. And I also took courses from these very, very leading people like Jürgen Ehlers. He was a master teacher, and he knew all of physics, so well, so deeply. I mean, later, he became the director of the Albert Einstein Institute, and then when he retired, he tried to recruit me to become the director of to take his place. But our association started in 1970 already. Me being a graduate student, just to give an illustration. I mean, again, a reality check to younger people, how hard one had to work and so on. So in the second year, I already took a course in general relativity, which was a graduate level course. And it was a lot of work, right? It was not easy to, do all these jumps. There was a lot of reading assignments, and I think that the professor was not pedagogical. I mean, his attitude was more or less throw things at you, and it's your job to pick up. And so it was not easy. I mean, other courses also had to work hard, but they were more systematic and it was regular. Whereas this was general relativity, which was kind of a advanced topic. In those days, there
Yeah.
weren't any textbooks or anything that one could follow, so it was really quite hard. So I remember distinctly, Organ Ellis was teaching a course in group theory. I was taking it, a fantastic course, and I sheepishly went to him and said, "Sir, I'm sorry, but I had so many assignments due, and so I was literally staying up till that night and such thing. So I know how to do these problems, but it will take me a few hours to write down the solutions. Can I please submit it a bit late?" And Jurgens then looked at me, and he's very authentic German Prussian actually, because he comes from Hamburg. And he looked at me and said, "Okay, this time, but don't make it a habit." And I felt so bad from that. So of course I told Jurgen later when we became friends. He was my mentor and he was very gracious. I mean, of course, there was a big age difference between the two of us. I mean, just to say these were not easy times, right? And so I felt both
Mm.
upset and I had to submit the homework the same day. So I mean, there were such incidents. I mean, it's not smooth sailing by any means, right? I mean,
Sir, slightly I want to touch upon the problem solving approach and how you tackle the challenges which every student during their graduate studies face, because earlier the problems are relatively simpler, easier, and as they move to higher education in terms of learn general relativity, quantum mechanics, and even like go to field theory and all, it becomes very important to be able to solve problems, but at the same time having a deeper insight about what the problem is about, and being able to visualize things. So just want to understand, like, how did you train yourself to do both and also do it well?
yeah, I have to say in retrospect, I'm surprised. I must have worked extremely hard, and that was the only reason why I could succeed.
Mm,
Uh, so the first year was not really research; it was really learning, 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 learning. It was in the second year that I began glimpses of research. But one of the things that I
mm,
had mentioned to you yes last time, I think that when you asked me about advice to students and such things, right? That you have to have broader
mm,
interests. You should not be just focused on your thesis topic kind of thing. So that second year,
mm,
when I had a little bit of breathing space, in the sense that I had caught up with my contemporaries, with my students in my class, in my batch, as one would say in India, that I felt comfortable enough to explore other things. So I did sit in
okay.
one of these courses in mathematics, um,
Mm,
which is called modern algebra. But there, I
mm,
learned techniques which are very powerful for quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, which helped me for a long time. So, I mean, it was a good decision. I mean, as far as I
mm,
remember, I was the only student from physics in that class. I
physics.
did not take that course because for credit, because we could only take 3 courses anyway. That would have been too much to do all the homeworks on time and everything. But I sat on it, and people allowed that. I mean, I took notes and tried to understand everything. And
Mm,
for example, that is a beginning of answer to your question, which is to start applying new methods to the problems. Because previously, as you say, in courses, you get problems, but it's clear that the solution technique, the reasoning is all in what was already taught to you. You just use those
mm,
ideas. So it's clear.
mm,
When you start doing research, which techniques are the best and what to apply and so on, and how to think about the problem. Because basically, you have a bunch of tools that you pick up as you go on. It's like your arsenal, if you like, in the warrior
mm,
analogy or something. But it's a basic set of tools that you pick up, and then which tools, first of all, the toolbox has to be rich enough, right?
mm,
Then which of these tools we should use to understand something, why this way, why not that way. I mean, in part one can be lucky, but in part you have to be strike a balance between the richness of tools and having the intuition, having the creativity to say that, well, for this problem I should be using these tools. So it turned out that those tools that I learned in this mathematics course, they turned out to be very, very helpful for my, applying them to research problems. I began just with something which is simple, like, ordinary quantum mechanics, like harmonic oscillator or something, but looking at it from a
mm,
new angle. Now, one was,
mm,
what do you learn by looking at it from a new angle? Well, as far as a harmonic oscillator is concerned, almost nothing, right? Because you get back the same results that you knew. But this new angle then generalizes to other things for which
mm,
the textbook treatment of harmonic oscillator does not apply. So that,
mm,
I think, was kind of a big change. So that second year, I mean, again, extremely fortunate that Bob Garosh had just
mm,
joined Austin, Texas at that year as a faculty
mm,
member. And I started talking to him, and I told him about this algebraic methods, which he was not aware of. And so
okay.
he liked them very much and so on. And so then when we started doing quantum gravity, we actually did it all from using these new methods, of course, generalizing them enormously in order to be able to apply them.
Mm,
It's having this breadth, having this space that allows new techniques, new ways of looking at things to come in. Because any one field, it can go deep, but everybody's looking at it in one way. Whereas sometimes you have to
mm.
look at it a slightly different way. And then you have to have the ability to look at it differently, but that requires this bunch of tools that one picks up.
Lateral exposure.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, there's a balance always, find balance, right? I mean, about how to breadth versus depth.
Absolutely.
You should not sacrifice one for the other. I mean, let
Yes.
me give another example which might be of interest to the Indian audience of it. Uh, I don't know. In retrospect, I'm very surprised by all these things. But in the one of the people who was one of the faculty members who was also in Austin had just come was Professor George Sudarshan or ECG Sudarshan. He was a very, very famous
He's
physicist that people have heard of, right? Exactly. And he has, I mean, he said himself several times that he deserved two Nobel Prizes, and I think it's completely right. He did work in quantum optics, which actually was
mm,
started with harmonic oscillator again, looking at it in certain ways and so on. And then
mm,
the prize went to Glauber, but he could easily have shared it. And secondly,
yeah.
he really did work on the weak interactions, the V minus A current, as they call it, uh,
Mm,
the parity violating current.
mm,
And then but he did that work with Marshak as a either student, yeah, as a student, and he could have
mm,
easily won the Nobel Prize. I think the only reason why it was not given was because there were four people, right? I mean, there was Marshak, Sudarshan, and then independently, Gelman and Feynman also found this,
mm,
found this thing. But chronologically, Sudarshan and Marshak came slightly earlier. But anyway, it was about the same time, and so four people would have to be given a Nobel Prize, and Nobel Prize is three, and so at most three. So therefore,
yeah.
it was never given. So he was very, very good. And I also started talking to him. I took advanced classical mechanics course with him, and he also was very nice to me. Even suggested me a research problem on which I worked. Did not succeed in doing very much. I worked quite a bit, but didn't get any research results, which are worth publishing or anything like that. But in talking to him, I also got interest. I mean, he was also very much interested in Indian philosophy or Indian spiritual traditions. Uh,
Mm,
and so I came to know that there was a famous Indian philosopher by name Raja Rao who was visiting Austin for 1 or 2 years,
mhm.
and as a visitor, he was giving an evening course on Vedanta. So I
Okay.
actually sat in that course also. I don't know how many hours I had in those days. I mean, I'm surprised by myself. I mean, by my current self, my current self, I wouldn't have energy to do so many things. Uh, so
Yeah.
I sat in that course. It's not that I, studied because it was trying to absorb, trying to understand the broader picture, the internal world, and everything. And by the way, that has been an
Mm,
interesting thing for me all along. This internal world. It's not just the
mm,
physical work, but it's in many ways, I think it's even more important. It is more important. But anyway, we
mm.
can talk about it at some stage if you feel.
Doing great.
So because it has a lot to do with the Indian tradition and
Mm,
particularly Vedanta and Buddhism and the differences between the two and everything. So, um, so at one stage, I remember Raja Rao used to sort of say a few things, and then people would ask questions, and then he would comment on them, right?
mm,
So I remember at one stage they were talking about somebody asked him a question about, but what about Buddha said something, and that didn't quite agree with
mm,
what Raja Rao was saying. I mean, basically, the difference. Sorry, I slight digression, but just those some people might be interested. The difference is that in Buddhism, they often um, emphasize this notion of shunyata, uh, nothingness, if you like, or
mm,
shunyata, and that is considered to be the highest thing. Shunyata, empty your mind, empty thing, and then there's shunyata. There's nothing. It's like vacuum or something. Whereas in the Vedantic traditions, it is not shunyata. It, yeah, it's oneness. It's not zeroness. It's the opposite. It's oneness, complete. Your consciousness and your
mm,
consciousness and universal consciousness become all one.
mm,
And so,
mm,
um, so Rajarao, coming from Vedantic tradition, sort of was somebody I must have asked him about shunyata and such thing, and he said, "Oh well, Buddha never reached the final state." Okay, so he meant that up to he reached up to the shunyata thing, but the final state is this oneness of the whole consciousness, and he did not reach it. So in those days, I don't know, even now, if I don't understand something, I don't keep quiet. I always ask. So I raised my ask and I said, "Sir, since neither you nor I have reached the final state, what is the point of discussing whether Buddha reached the final state?" And this was quite, you know. So Raja. So first of all, I thought I was being very uh, disrespectful, but I felt that, well, I had to ask this question because I had to understand myself, kind of thing. Why are you talking, disrespecting Buddha like that? Who are you to disrespect Buddha? That was the kind of thing I was saying. But then his answer, which I did not understand at the time, and I was quite upset about his answer, but later I did understand, was,
Oh.
"Speak for yourself, young man." So you're saying that he
Mm.
had reached the final state. Okay.
Mm.
And I mean, that at that time I thought it was so completely outrageous, and but if there is time, then we can discuss this final state and what it means in terms
Yeah,
of
please.
neuroscience nowadays. It really does make sense,
Mm.
and what does it make sense and so on. Okay. So this is just an example of this, again, breadth, trying to explore various directions. Of course, one has to
Mm.
manage within one energy, and one should not overdo
Absolutely.
things. But in some ways, when you're young, you should experiment also. You will fail a few times. If you're afraid of failure, you would not achieve great things either. But in some sense, you should know when to withdraw, not just be uh, uh, completely obstinate and just say that this is it, this is it, this is it. I mean, at one stage, you also take into account the external world, but don't take into account the external world and then stop doing something. At least try, and then you might realize the external world is right. And very often it is, but it is not always
Mm.
right. So that was
Mm. What circumstances led you to your transition from UT Austin to University of Chicago?
in the time when I was in the second year of UT Austin, right? I started doing some beginning of research with Bob Garosh, trying to with Professor Garosh. Uh, and the point is that Bob is only 6 years older than me, so it's not big difference. I mean, because he had only, or 7 years older than me, because he got a professorship 3 years after his postdoc, right? I mean, and so I
Mm.
was 21 and he was probably 27, so or 28.
Mm.
Uh, and so he was very youthful, and there always was such a purity about him, and you could see that his intellectual energy was bursting out. And in some ways, that was because of this inner purity, that he was not hung up on ego. He was not sort of, "Oh, I am this and this." And that was extremely refreshing. So I was also not afraid of him, and that because he was so welcoming. So I would try out my
Mm.
ideas, and he liked that. I mean, I would try out, which was not very deep or anything, but he still liked that. And at one
Mm.
stage, uh, we were discussing something, and I suggested something, and then we ran into a roadblock. We could not proceed. Right? There was a roadblock. I mean, that. And then I was walking on this main street in Austin, and just after outside the university, just to go home. And Bob and his wife were in a car, and Bob's wife Mary
Mm.
was driving the car. So he asked her to stop and pull over. He jumped out of the car and told me, we were stuck about this thing, but we forgot this point, and therefore it all worked. How many
Oh.
advisors do you think would jump out of their car to tell you something that you are, technically stuck with, a few hours before? So there was such a liveliness and such beauty in the interaction with Bob. I'm still so happy when I think about Bob, right? Because of his whole being was such refreshing and so on. By the way, in Chicago, then I met Professor Chandra, the famous astrophysicist, right? And Chandra, for some reason, he did take reasonable liking to me, and he would actually talk to me not only science but other things. Now,
Okay.
much later, I realized because he was trying to transmit to me some deep sense of values with the general
Okay.
things, right? I mean, that he talked to me, which I absorbed osmosis, and only later I realized that that is what Chandra was trying to do. But Chandra told me that except for John von Neumann, he has never seen anybody as bright as Bob Garrosh. And this coming from Chandra, who had seen everybody internationally, and so it was quite a thrill. So I started with working with Bob, and just after 1 year in Texas, Bob Garrosh got an offer to go to Chicago.
Mm.
And so I went with him. But this is also interesting why this offer came. Because it turned out that the year before he joined UT to Texas, right? That summer,
Mhm.
so this must have been summer of 1970, 1970 or 71, I forget now, 1970 or 71. That summer, when I was just finishing up his postdoc at Syracuse, Chandra had decided to get interested to transit to general relativity. Every year, every
Okay.
10 years, Chandra changed his field.
10 years.
Yeah, except that last 30 years almost he stayed, or 20 years he stayed in general relativity. Okay, so every 10 years he was looking for a new field, and then he went to a conference in Warsaw in 1962. It was a very famous, very interesting conference. I wasn't there, of course. I was in school, but I read the proceedings, and luckily they actually tape recorded all the discussions, which almost never happens, and the discussions are there. And when I was a student in Chicago, I used to borrow this book for the whole quarter to learn from those discussions. Because when you discuss, you say what is in your mind, right? So you learn the thinking process, you learn the creative process through this discussion. So I really enjoyed that very much. So Chandra was personally in that conference, and that is when he had decided to change over. And by the end of 60s, then he had made up his mind completely. So in 69, Chandra would have been 59. So almost 60 years old. But in his style, he decided to learn general relativity was the best way was to get the three brightest young people to lecture him. So he
Okay.
invited to Chicago that summer, in either 70 or 71, which I forget. So the three people were Brannon Carter, who was in Cambridge and who was a
Okay.
collaborator of Hawking's, and they wrote very influential papers on black holes together. Second was George Ellis, a cosmologist, South African one, and he has written the book with Hawking, which is called the Hawking and Ellis book on general relativity. It's called Large Scale Structure of Space-Time. And third was Bob Garrosh. So he invited all of them, and they would actually, each of them would give 1 hour talk in the morning. I don't know if it was every day or every other day during those whatever period they were, some at least a month, maybe 2 months. And Chandra would take notes. Audience was basically just Chandra. Maybe other people are attended. But Bob told me that Chandra would call them in the evening to say, but you said
Okay.
this, but this doesn't follow from that. And what did you mean? Like a real student. Chandra was actually doing, I mean, at the age of 60, and these were kids, right? These kids were mid-20s. I mean, so Chandra had that humility and that rigor, intellectual rigor to learn from the best. And it doesn't matter if they're young or whatever it is. And so at the end of that, Chandra decided to offer the position to Bob Garrosh. And so Bob Garrosh went to Chicago. It was quite amazing. Basically, 4 years after his PhD, he was a full professor at the University of Chicago, which was considered to be one of the best universities. So Bob asked me if I wanted to go to Chicago. Of course, I had to apply and all that. So I said yes, and so I applied, and I got in. And I mean, Austin was very, very good. For example, in this, I had this set of interviews with philosophers of science who specialize in general relativity. And they also asked me this question, but why did you go to Chicago? Because Chicago did not have any relativity. And Austin was, so I told you all these names. They knew about those names from history of science. Said, all of these people were in Austin. And why did you leave Austin? That's a very good question. And when I told them that, well, yes, Austin was extremely good in general relativity, but in all-round physics, Chicago was much better. They were very surprised. But it was really the case, I mean, for example, in the office of the associate chair, who was in charge of student affairs, graduate students and everything. I mean, took care of that administrative matters basically. His name was Saul Krasner. So he had this room with a big picture frame, and that he had the pictures of all the Nobel laureates from University of Chicago. It's a huge one, right? I mean, all the Nobel laureates from University, and very, very cleverly, he had placed it so that the last piece was not a picture, but was actually a mirror, so that when the students came, they would be the last person. So, I mean, whereas University of Austin, nobody had a Nobel Prize at that time, right? I mean, uh, but a bit later, a faculty member did get a Nobel Prize, but at that time, nobody. So it was regarded as much more prestigious, in terms of physics, and also the mathematics department is superb in Chicago. And so, because of these two things, I applied to Chicago, and luckily I got into Chicago. So at the end of the second year in Austin, right? I mean, I was going to move to Chicago, but then I'd been away from home for for 2 years. So I decided to make a trip home. I had saved enough money to make the trip. So this was in 1972 already. And then I went home up here. And then it turned out that, at that time, Sudarshan had a
mm,
guru, that is to say, a spiritual master that he thought was enlightened and that he thought would really be useful for me to meet. So I
mm.
made the trip to Kerala. This was a small village in Kerala called
Okay.
Malakara. And I went there, go by train, and from my hometown. And my parents were, my family was not happy because I was there for a little while, and why are you not spending time with us? And so,
Yes.
but I decided to go to Malakara, and I was there for 10 days. I went to all the talks. I sat there, and there were some people. Sudarshan came for a couple of days, but there are also other people,
Mm,
and there's particularly one artist who was, I came to know later, was very very famous artist in Paris. And
mm.
I went to Paris afterwards, so I know a few things. That if we have time, we can talk about that. He
Yeah.
was there as well, and many of these people would sit there, and you all call this Mr. Name Menon, but he was called Gurudev. So Gurudev would actually give this, say a few things and such thing, and these people would sit there and they would have tears in their eyes flowing, just out of just listening to those words and so on. And nothing happened to me. Nothing whatsoever happened to me. And I would look at them, and I respected these people, but nothing happened to me. So at the
Mm,
end of the day, I decided, well, I mean, you have to listen to yourself,
mm.
And so I decided that I this is not it. I mean, for me, it is not the this is not the
Yeah.
way, so to
Yeah.
say. So I just didn't do it.
This is the explanation to go on to.
Exactly. So
It's not the
whatever
idea.
is good for me, I mean, for me, it is not good. That was the thing. And then after that summer, so this was the summer of
Mm.
'72, that Bob Garosh was spending in Berkeley, and with a
Okay.
cosmologist and a gravitational wave physicist by the name Ray Sachs, who was a former
Mm,
student um, of Peter Bergman. He had moved to
mhm,
University of Berkeley, the mathematics department. He was a professor then. From Austin, Texas, he had moved to Berkeley, and so Bob
mm,
Garosh went and visited them for the summer, and I went and visited them for maybe 6 weeks. So I was there. So there I came to know this Ray Sachs a little bit. I came to talk to know his students. Quite, one student was, then later was quite famous by name Doug Eardley, to know what they were working on and so on. But this was a phase in my life. This was kind of after 2 years of graduate work. I had worked extremely hard. I had caught up with other people, and I started just doing research. But
mm,
I say now, what I'm saying now is really, I hope, will be useful to students and younger researchers. So, but I had this attitude that, well, I would have this idea, which is kind of a reasonably good idea, I thought at least.
mhm,
And I thought, well, one can do this. So, the problem can be solved. And you just have to do this.
mm, mm,
So at one
mm,
stage, in spite of his real niceness and everything, Bob Garrosh told me, you know, at some stage, one has to stop saying one can do this and do it.
mm.
And it was to me, it was a harsh comment at that time, but it was absolutely
Yeah.
necessary for me. It was exactly
Yes.
right, because I had gone into that layer in which one sort of says, "Oh, well, yeah, you can do it." There's no, I mean, then why don't you do it, right? Because it's an important
Mm,
problem. So, so I think
yeah.
that was very good for me, and I know it brought me down to earth. I mean, that's why I'm telling you this.
Mm,
And then I began doing, uh, long calculations before just saying one can do it. I mean, I'm checking various
mm,
things and so on. So that was very good for me up there. So, and then I had to go to Chicago from Berkeley, and
yeah.
of course I had no money. I mean, I'd come back from India, I used up a lot of savings and such thing, so I could not fly to Chicago. It's quite a long trip. I mean, but I decided to take the Greyhound bus, because in those days Greyhound the bus company had a kind of a $99 ticket. You can go anywhere in the United States, and some period of time, around 15 days, anywhere. You can change anywhere. You
Mm,
can stop. You can break the journey, but you can take it. So I took this
Oh.
$99 thing from Berkeley to actually from San Francisco to um, to Chicago, and I thought it was extremely long. I don't know, 3 days or something like that. So
It's a long journey.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I think 3 days because the buses really keep the speed limit and everything. And
Mm.
so and also, I was going to Chicago. It was getting colder and such thing, and so I had no warm clothes. I mean, I sweaters, but Chicago cold is Chicago cold can be minus. Um, 30 degrees, minus 20 degrees. So it can be very cold. So I had to buy overcoat. So I stopped in Salt Lake City, broke the journey in Salt Lake City, stayed in a cheap motel somewhere. And I went to this old clothes store because Salt Lake City is also cold. And that time, since it was summertime, they were selling, winter clothes. So I got a cheap coat. I remember still that. And I wore that for most of my student days in Chicago. It was a little bit too big for me.
Mm.
That's the way one is. And so then I landed up in Chicago. And Chicago, I was already used to United States quite a bit and so on. But it was also quite an experience because University of Chicago is in Hyde Park. It's a very, very famous university. Enrico Fermi was there. That is where the first atomic pile was compiled. The first nuclear
Mm-hmm.
reaction took place on the campus of University of Chicago, believe it or not.
Oh.
So Enrico Fermi had the football team, the American football team, carry the rods, the equipment from his lab to the stadium, to the not stadium, to the open field, because they had this thing done on open field. And in that open field,
Mm.
they set up the first sustained controlled chain reaction. If it
Oh.
had gone wrong, it would have blown up the whole city.
Yeah.
And then there were three people there. There's Enrico Fermi, there was Edward Teller, and John von Neumann. And the whole point was,
Mm.
it's a chain reaction, and so there are
Yes.
absorbers of neutrons which are cadmium, and so they had cadmium rods, and they had to put in the cadmium rods to make sure that it doesn't become a supercritical and blow up, right? And so there are these three
Yes.
people standing there telling how much to push the cadmium rods, and Enrico Fermi would do his calculations on slide rule. Because looking at the reaction rate, he would say, and then Edward Taylor had a log table, and John von
Uh-huh.
Neumann would do it in his head,
Yeah.
and all of them agreed, then they agreed. It's amazing that such things took place in the University of Chicago. So we learn all these stories, and the atmosphere of this is where history is made. This is a great place.
Yeah.
And of course,
Absolutely.
Chandra was there all his life, right? From 1970s, 35 years he had already spent, mid 1930s too.
Chandra is a towering figure in the University of Chicago, and just going and approaching, meeting him first time would have been, a special thing for you. Also, later on, every time meeting him on the premises and having interaction. So, tell us about your interactions with
Professor
Professor.
Chandra. As I mentioned just 2 minutes ago, right? I mean, about Chandra's style of working. He was not like Bob Garosh. He was not bubbling. He was much more calm and much more precise, much more sharp. Bob Garosh, had
Mhm.
never tucked in his shirt. His shirt was always out. Chandra came in a three-piece suit, which there were woolen
Mm.
suits in winter and silk suits in summer. So very different personalities. But when it came to science, they were equals, right? I mean, Chandra, as I said, Chandra invited these three
He's
young.
learning from.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Three young, people in their mid-20s and took notes and called them. So Chandra had this attitude about knowledge and science, which was unbelievable. And so,
Mm.
um, so it turned out that the interaction, as you say, when I first went,
Mm.
Chandra was like a god for me, right? I heard so much
Mm.
about Chandra and from everything, right? From
Mm.
his episode with Eddington and things that he done on the
Yes.
boat from going from India to Cambridge, and I heard all these stories, and so it's really not a human; it's like a god or something like that. And then seeing him in seminars, interacting, treating us as if we were his equal. Was the way that we felt more at ease. It's not that he was, yeah, tolerated stupidities. There was a younger student who would put his feet on the chair, and Chandra would tell him to sit straight. It's not so he was. It's not that he did not have his standards, or he did not use his standards to the students. But when it came to intellectual query, he was just completely one of us. So, I mean, of
Mm.
course, it was very slow that my interaction with him grew, right? The first year, it was not so
Mm.
much. My first year in Chicago, so my third year in graduate student. But my fourth and fifth year, there was a really
Mm.
close interaction. The times, particularly in the last year, he would actually call me to his office and, we'll discuss some science. But then he would also
Mm.
air things, general things, and particularly last year. And so at that stage, he was 62 at that time, no, 63 maybe. And so he would, I mean, he always read up a lot, right, about what other great men or women did in their life and their biographies. And he knew a lot of first-hand details, and also because he was a fellow of
Mhm.
the Royal Society, he had access to the personal memoirs.
Mm.
And so he was telling about Rutherford. And so, I mean, he would pull
Mm.
up these anecdotes from all the historical figures, right? I mean, that I'd only heard of. So with Lord Rutherford, he used to say he wondered if, in fact, a man after 60, because in those days scientists were all men, right? So there's a man after
Mm.
60, does he do more harm or good to science?
Mm.
So and Chandra was 63, right? So he had obviously thought quite a bit about this question. And
Mm.
he said that, well, then Rutherford replied, he says himself, uh, I think Rutherford had raised this question to his son, and in that discussion, this came up. And
Mm.
Rutherford replied, his son was also a physicist, very famous.
Mm.
So he said that he came to the conclusion that if the person does not get in the way of younger people, then there's no harm in continuing. And they may
Mm.
even contribute something. So he had thought about such thing, and these are kind of, in some ways, in retrospect, very intimate thoughts, right? Because one is 60 and
Yeah.
one is talking about, are you useless? Are you doing more harm, or are you doing more good or something? So I mean, there were such things that were very, very, very nice of him, that Chandra. By the way, when I did reach 60, I didn't forget this, and I kept that in mind, that what one should do and what one should not do and such things. And in fact, last week there was somebody's 60th birthday, and this conference was in their honor. And so I again went and told them this story of Chandra. So it's a good thing to remember.
That's
But also otherwise, right? I mean, because the group was small and nice, and particularly Bob Gorosh's
mm.
free spirit, niceness personality. It's not egoless personality. That I think. So we used to, twice a year or something, we would have a potluck dinner, right? Now so they would rent some space, and everybody would bring some food, and we would share food and
So,
eat and so. And then at that time, then people said some things, and so Chandra would tell us stories about Dirac and about everything. So that's a personality which is very, very nice. I mean, uh,
mm.
yeah. Also personally, he
So,
told me about these stories about Dirac, about how he and Dirac would go for long walks on Sundays. Dirac liked to take a long walk on Sunday,
uh,
but they were completely quiet
mm.
because Dirac didn't speak very much. Dirac was very well known for that, not speaking. So we heard a lot of interesting stories from Chandra.
During your time at Chicago, right? At that time, Hawking discovered, I mean, he wrote a paper about Hawking radiation. And from my reading, I gather that you had to present that to Professor Chandra and a large audience. So, could you tell us about
Yeah, right.
that?
Thank you. Yeah. So this was I think in 1974. So this is when I finished this summer, or I went to Oxford in September. So I finished sometime in August or July of 1974. But that spring, in those days there was no internet, so we all got preprints, right? So no, I didn't
Mm.
get it. I mean, the professors got preprints. So Bob Garosh had this preprint. Bob knew Stephen Hawking quite well because he was a postdoc in Oxford, and they're roughly the same age. Stephen was also a postdoc at that time, and they in fact proved some theorems which are very similar to each other, so-called singularity
Mm.
theorems. The most famous are
Mm.
the ones due to Penrose and Hawking, but also
Mm.
the Garrosh, so the singularity theorems.
Oh.
So this Garrosh had these preprints, and so and it was considered to be a famous thing. So let me say what it is to put it in perspective.
Mm.
So basically, it
Mm.
had to do with black holes. Chandra Chandra's work basically showed that a collapse could be halted if the mass of the star is not too high, because as the as the star collapses, basically you just have either electrons or neutrons. For our purpose, it will be neutrons. There'll be inverse beta decay
mm,
in which the protons absorb electron and the neutrino and become neutrons. So, but then neutrons are spin 1/2 particles, so you cannot put two of them in the same space, same place, and therefore there is an effective pressure, outward pressure. And so if then the star is collapsing, this effective outward pressure can balance the gravitational attraction. But gravitational attraction increases with the mass of the star, whereas this effective pressure that we have talked about doesn't increase with the mass of the star. So if the star is very massive, then this equilibrium would not occur, and one would have a black hole, basically.
and black.
Chandra was talking about white dwarfs, not neutron stars. I'm talking about neutron stars. But exactly the same idea is applicable to neutron stars. So people didn't believe in black holes. Most astronomers did not believe in black holes. There were exceptions, but most astronomers didn't believe in black holes. And this is just figment of imagination, Einstein, relativity, etc. This is all not relevant. But then, in fact, it is really true, because Chandra was working on black holes, for example. His masterpiece is on mathematical theory of black holes. But even his students, when they gave a talk in MIT, is a leading place in this talk, right? The leading physicists there say, yeah, this is all fine that you're working on this, but these are all mathematical ideas. They have no physical relevance. Why are you spending so much time? And this was I'm talking about mid 70s now. And Chandra had done the work in the 30s, right? Early 30s. So there was a reluctance to accept that there can be black holes in the world. And now the astronomers are completely flipped over. Now they think there are black holes everywhere, right? So it's a completely interesting transition. In the early 70s, thanks largely due to Stephen Hawking, but he took some seminal ideas of Roger Penrose to develop this theory of black holes and so on. And then there was a precise formulation of black holes, because previous discussions were all tied to simplest solutions of Einstein's equation, Schwarzschild solution of Einstein's equation. So Stephen Hawking and Brandon Carter, that I mentioned, that Chandra had invited to lecture him together with Bob Garosh and George Ellipse. So Brandon Carter and Stephen Hawking, they developed this theories of black hole much more. And classically, black holes are completely black. But then Jacob Bekenstein, who was also a student of John Wheeler's, just like Bob Garosh was a student of John Wheeler's, in his PhD thesis, developed a lot of thought experiments. Because he said, well, supposing I got a boiling cup of tea here, okay, and here is a black hole, and so it has a lot of entropy, and I pour it into the black hole, and so the tea disappears, the entropy is lost, so I can violate the second law of thermodynamics by reducing the entropy in this particular way. And so it looks very weird. So therefore, they thought that no, if I pour the tea in the black hole, then black hole's entropy should go up. But what is black hole entropy? How can it have entropy? Because it is completely black. That is to say, if something is completely black, it has zero temperature, and at zero temperature, objects would not have any entropy. So how can it be, etc. So Bekenstein came to the conclusion that you can have an associate a multiple of the area as the entropy. Now, the entropy is dimensionless because the logarithm of number of states, whereas area has dimension of length squared. So that means that you need a constant. And Bekenstein said that so-called Planck length, which is to say bring in h bar, would be that constant. And so his point was that if h bar goes to zero, then entropy becomes infinite. So black hole has infinite entropy, if you like. But if h bar is, in the real world, h bar, the Planck's constant is finite, and then that would make the entropy of the black hole finite. So he suggested this idea, but still, it seems strange. It's a completely black object. It has zero temperature. How can it be? And even Hawking initially thought that no, these laws of black hole mechanics, as they are called, these are all just analogies with thermodynamics. They look like thermodynamics, but you should not think of in thermodynamic terms. Area is area, so-called surface gravity, etc. But Bekenstein suggested that area is related to entropy, and surface gravity is related to temperature of the black hole. But then people thought it was wrong because temperature is zero, surface gravity is not zero, so how can it be right? So the Hawking then did the following calculation. He said that supposing I got a black hole geometry and I just have a quantum field in it. So the matter field is quantum mechanical, geometry is still classical, and the quantum
Mm.
field starts out in the vacuum state. So that is, there's nothing, there's no excitation, there's no energy in them. But still, because the black hole has as a gravitational field, it can pump energy. Energy can be transferred from the black hole into the quantum field. And then Hawking did
Mm.
this calculation to show that in fact, because that such a process exists, and the black holes can actually radiate as though they were black
Mhm.
bodies at some temperature, and that temperature was then the same as the h bar times the surface gravity, and as h bar goes to zero, does go to zero. So in classical
Mm.
general relativity, the temperature is zero, entropy is infinite. But when you bring in h bar, when you bring in quantum effects, then the statement is different. That is, so it was a big shock in the physics community about this. Of course, outside gravity, people didn't believe, didn't take it seriously. Even much
Mm.
later, people didn't take it much seriously. But it
Mm.
had some rather startling consequences the way that Hawking first proposed it. Hawking withdrew much later in his life. He withdrew. We'll talk about that when you talk about quantum
Mm.
gravity and such things. But I mean, Hawking effect is real. But then what he built on it, and he came to some conclusions which he withdrew later on. This basic idea that black holes radiate quantum mechanically was a new idea. And since I had been
Mm.
thinking about quantum gravity, and actually I had even written
Mm.
paper with Bob Garosh on quantum gravity. So when the paper came out, then it seemed that I was the only person in the group who had sort of the knowledge of what was required. And so they asked me to give a series of talks, 2 or 3 talks, not nothing. So I
Okay.
thought it was, mainly for students and postdocs that I can explain what the general ideas are, what Hawking is saying, and so on. And to my shock, the first day, there was Chandra in the audience, which I didn't. He came to all the talks, and also there was a famous particle physicist, high energy theorist by name uh, Aichiro Nambu, who then later on got a Nobel Prize as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has very influential ideas in particle physics. He was also in the audience, and they were asking questions about the Hawking effect, and it was very nice to say a few things about. I mean, in part, this happened because of this review paper that I told you about with Bob Garosh on quantum gravity. So
Yeah.
normally, review papers are written by senior scientists who have worked in the field for a long time.
To summarize the state of the
State of
field.
the field. So when I started working with Bob, I wanted to do quantum gravity. At that time, I was reasonably ambitious, and so Bob felt fine. He had not worked in quantum gravity; he had worked on classical relativity. And after me, he did not really do quantum things either. I mean, while I was there, he did write this lecture notes on geometrical quantum mechanics, which actually a lot of it was also discussions between us, but it was really Bob's lecture. I mean, I profited much more than he profited from me. But then we decided we wanted to understand the subject, and typically Bob likes to understand the subject in his own way.
Okay.
And so instead of just reading the literature and reproducing what it is, we tried to project our understanding on the literature. It's opposite of what one normally does. Saying, well, I mean, these are the basic ideas of relativity, these are the basic ideas of quantum mechanics. If you combine them, then these are the possible things that can happen. Oh, this particular approach puts quantum mechanics on for forefront and relativity as a background drop, and then this comes out. This approach puts
Mm.
general relativity on forefront and quantum mechanics adds on to that later, and then this happens. We'll talk about this more
Okay.
when you talk about quantum gravity. But so we wrote this first
Mm.
paper. So my first paper is actually exactly 50 years ago
You.
now. 1974 it
Mm.
appeared, and it was on quantum gravity. And when this paper was written, the funny thing is, there's also a funny story about it that Chandra told me, since you are asking me about Chandra. So
Mm.
we first wrote this paper, and then we wanted to submit it somewhere. And we thought, that Bob Garosh had some American journal in mind, a very good journal in mind. But apparently Chandra persuaded him to submit it to a British journal, which Chandra was aware of. So, which is called Reports on Progress of Physics. And so Bob was a senior author, so he sent the paper to them. Although, my name comes first because of his alphabetical order. And I should say that, I mean, a lot of writing was Bob's because he had this beautiful way of writing. I learned a lot from that.
Mm.
But then this article went, and then we got a letter back from the editor. who was some senior physicist,
mm,
basically saying that, well, they had just published another article a year or two ago on the same topic, so they don't want to
okay.
publish it or something. So Chandra told me
Mm-hmm.
later that, therefore, Bob Gorosh went to him and said, well, I mean, we sent it to the journal because you suggested, and this is the letter we got. So apparently Chandra wrote to the editor that, and saying that, probably saying extremely complimentary things about us and about the article. So then the editor wrote back saying, actually, on second thoughts, we will publish your article. So it got published. So I know this only from Chandra. I've not seen any documents about this thing. So this was an interesting episode. But for example, in writing this article, again, something comes up about personalities. At one stage, we sort of had gathered ideas about various approaches, and quite a bit of it is actually very heavily influenced by these ideas I brought from this course in mathematics that I took in Austin. I mean, of course, we developed it further or something, but we applied it very nicely there. And it's a new way of looking at many things. Dirac had developed a theory for general relativity. It's called Dirac theory of constraints, because the dynamics is constrained in a very non-trivial way, and what happens, and it was all in coordinates, and it is of course completely right, but its real meaning was not clear to us. And so we, Bob mainly, put it in a more geometrical language in which the invariant content of it was completely clear. If you like, invariant content means that you leave all the extra baggage out, and you only keep the things that are essential to make the arguments. So we had done this in classical relativity, and then for quantum theory, we use these ideas from algebraic quantum field theory and so on and so forth. And so that was a quite useful thing. So I mean, just as to close, then I just want to say that in my Chicago experience, really, Bob Gorosh and Chandra were my mentors, and I learned enormous amount of things from them. Right? Absolutely. I mean, many years later, I wrote to Bob saying that, well, I really often feel that everything I know came from you. I mean, it's outgrowth of what Bob taught. I developed it further, but in some ways, Bob's greatest strengths are his incredible clarity and penetrating reasoning, right? So basically, as I said about this paper, we did not just read the other papers and report what they were doing. We first had a viewpoint, and we looked at how these various papers fit in that particular viewpoint, right? I mean, and so we had developed a kind of a framework to think in terms of which to think about quantum gravity. So Bob was like that. He liked to develop his own framework, and he continued to do that. And so I learned that from him. And so I just want to give you one simple example about this. That in those days there was no internet, so one had this Bob Gorosh and Chandra would get these preprints, right? Bob Gorosh would get more mathematical relativity preprints, Chandra more astrophysical ones. So, but very often, once a week, we went to a pizza place with Bob. And Bob would bring a bunch of preprints. And we were supposed to read the title and the abstract.
Okay.
And then guess how this was proved.
Okay.
And this is like,
Without reading.
instead of reading the paper, you are supposed to think about it yourself in your own way or something. So this is the style that I picked up with Bob very, very much, namely even today, right? I mean, it's much easier for me I listen to an idea in a talk. It's much easier for me to try to work out that idea than to go to the paper and read the paper, so to say. I mean, what this does is to give you a perspective which is kind of your own, in which everything is unified, right? I can be doing black holes, I can be doing Big Bang, I can be doing some mathematical theory of general relativity, I can be doing some pure mathematics problem, so-called symplectic geometry, problem geometry, but it will be a unified viewpoint. I can make connections between these two things because they all come. It's not that I just learned this from here, this from here, this from here, this from here. They're all folded into my understanding. So that's a great strength of it. And that is what I learned from Bob Gorosh. And I think on the whole, I'm very happy with it. But it does have severe limitation. And as I perhaps mentioned to you, when I got much older, I realized that one's greatest strengths are one's greatest limitations also. They are the other side of the coin. Because people who can quickly read a paper and see, they proceed much more fast than I can do, because I have to redo the paper in my way. It takes much longer. And so I sacrifice speed in favor of unity and a unified
mm,
picture and a solid core, if you like. And people
mm,
who
mm,
learn a little bit here, learn a little bit here, learn a little bit here, learn a little bit here. In that, they all make a connection between this and this, two
mm,
extremes. But in the one area that they are looking at, they're much faster than
mm,
I am. And so, therefore,
mm,
there's this other side of the coin that I came to realize, also much later. From
mm,
Chandra, what I learned is not so much technical things. I mean, it's not that I did not learn technical things, but not so much.
mm,
But I learned much more what it is to be a scientist. What is
mm,
the core of a scientist, right? I mean, he would
mm,
tell you, he would tell us his stories, and he would us his own, tell me his own role, tell me other people and such. And of course, he never criticized other people, but from the way he said
mm,
it and such thing, one could see what he valued and what he thought was
mm,
lacking in some other people and such thing. And
mm.
so that, I think, shaped my attitude
Approach.
towards science very, very much. And so these are the two things. And the third thing that came is from my postdoc years from Roger Penrose. So basically,
Mm,
Roger Penrose and Chandrasekhar and Bob Garosh are my mentors in the
mm,
anti-chronological order. And I learned very different
mm,
things from the three of them. And I think that all of them I value enormously. And I'm most grateful to them and
mm.
also to the fortune or whatever it is that I got to interact with them. Okay.
It's very interesting to walk down the history lane and learn a lot from your experiences. I'm quite sure that this is going to be really helpful to all the researchers and students. So, thank you so much again spending time with us.